All right, welcome to part 2 lecture of week 9 with plant biology here at NICC. So this part of the lecture is going to be in chapter 32 of the Biology 2E OER textbook. Again, part 1 was chapter 7 and 8 in the Concepts of Biology textbook. So 7 and 8 should have gotten you guys a good base understanding of meiosis and then why meiosis is important for the formation of gametes. Chapter 32, which we're going to cover now, is really about these sort of reproductive strategies that plants have and sort of putting those gametes that they produced into action. So we're going to start out and we're going to talk a little bit about this concept called alternation of generations. And this is kind of a strange concept. To me anyways, it's strange because there are two distinct life stages in plants where we have what's called the sporophyte and the gametophyte generation. And the sporophyte generation is 2N, and the gametophyte generation is 1N. And again, depending on the type of plant, the gametophyte or the sporophyte will be dominant depending on what type of plant it is. Most of the plants that you see in sort of everyday walking around are going to be sporophyte. That's going to generally be the sporophyte generation. But when we look at mosses and liverworts and things like that, in those plants, the gametophyte is definitely the dominant generation. Either way, it's still a way of separating out different life stages for different sorts of purposes of the plant. With the gametophyte, this is really a life stage that produces gametes via meiosis. The sporophyte generation is not producing the gametes. They produce the gametophyte generation as they undergo meiosis, but as the gametophyte generation matures, it undergoes meiotic division to continually just produce these 1N cells. So it's there's still a meiosis division because the sporophyte generation is meiotically dividing, but that doesn't go directly into reproductive cells. We have this additional sort of life stage that is of varying levels of independence that then undergo mitotic division to produce 1N gamete. 1N gametes. Sorry, I have to find that spot on my camera. Always a good challenge. So, finding understanding the difference between the gametophyte and the sporophyte generations is an important concept when we're talking about plants, because these reproductive structures are either going to be in the gametophyte or the sporophyte generation. And we're looking at angiosperms, so angiosperms being this big group of flowering plants. The dominant form of plants on Earth today are angiosperms. We can start out and we can look at these flower structures, and in figure 32.3 in the text gives a really nice basic sort of understanding of these different sorts of structures in angiosperms. Again, this figure is sort of a generic figure, and there are definitely variations on this theme. In some cases we have male-only flowers or female-only flowers. In some cases we have sort of hermaphroditic flowers where we have male and female parts all in the same structure. Regardless, they're still going to have these same sorts of breakout parts. So we have the andrecium, which is the male part, and the gynecium, which is the female part. So going through the text, understanding the differences in these sorts of structures and how they relate to pollen production and then pollination is important. When we're looking at the male gametophyte, we're really looking at pollen grains. And so in plants, or in these angiosperms, the gametophyte generation has really just shrunk down to this minuscule little multicellular, but not very many cells. It's not able to live independently of the sporophyte generation. It's just simply released into the environment, however it's released, as these pollen grains. And so within the male gametophyte, we have the development of these gametes, which then go on to fertilize the female gametes that are produced in the female gametophytes. In the female gametophytes, these are not as distinct as a pollen grain because they tend to be just generally housed on the structure of the plant, because the plant needs to produce or provide rather energy to aid in the development of seed and fruit. So usually the female structures stay put on the plant for additional sort of access to resources, while often the male gametophyte is released out into the environment. Some plants self-fertilize, some plants don't self-fertilize. There's lots of variation depending on what type of plants we're talking about. Regardless, we can look at these different parts of the female gametophyte and see that we have the development of these gametes within the gametophyte itself, which eventually get fertilized by the male gametophyte via the pollen tube, and those nuclei fusing within the embryo sac. We can look at different types or classes of plants, and they're going to have varying sorts of reproductive strategies depending on what type of plant we're looking at. This first group that the book talks about are gymnosperms. So these are your sort of typical pine trees, and there's lots and lots of different types of gymnosperms, but if you think about a pine tree, that's a great sort of mental image to think about when you're looking at gymnosperms. And gymnosperms have a fairly primitive reproductive structures and cycles. They don't have development of a full fruit, but they do have these cone structures. So we can have male cones and female cones, and again, it depends on what sort of plant we're looking at, whether they're monoecious or dioecious. But we're still producing pollen as a male gametophyte, and the female gametophyte is housed in the female cones where the seeds then develop. There's some really nice imagery in the textbook 3210 that looks at these cross sections of what these female the female gametophytes and female reproductive structures look like, and you can see that you can really see these structures as they are sort of in these cross sections of the cones themselves. We can look at the difference between angiosperms and gymnosperms as well, because in angiosperms, the female gametophyte is enclosed in this external structure that's called the ovule, and really what we get here is the ability to develop a true fruit in association with these fertilization events. With angiosperms, we also get this concept called double pollination, and where we get this development of what's called the angiosperm, hence the name. And this is a key sort of difference between the angiosperms and the gymnosperms as well. All right, so how do we move pollen from one place to another? That's really, when we're talking about pollination, that's what we're talking about, moving this genetic material from one organism to the next. Now, some plants will self-pollinate, but many will not. That's as a way of preventing self-pollination. We're encouraging diversity in these organisms. So sexual reproduction is only advantageous if we're reproducing with different organisms. If we're self-reproducing sexually, we're still just reproducing with ourselves, of course, being plants, and that doesn't really confer any diversity into the gene pool. So many plants have strategies to prevent self-pollination, but most plants have different strategies for cross-pollination as well. Whether it's wind, whether we're looking at pollination by insects. This is a truly fascinating subject within plants, looking at the strategies that plants have evolved alongside insects to encourage insects to work as reproductive carriers of pollen from one plant to another. Whether it's nectar, being sort of a sweet treat for bees or other insects or birds or whatever to move from one flower to the next. That's why bees are moving from flower to flower, collecting this nectar, or even in some cases collecting the pollen to eat. This is a way that diversity is encouraged by cross-pollination. Other insects pollinate as well. There are some flowers that smell like rotting meat. Those are, not surprisingly, pollinated by flies. They'll fly onto that spot because they think it's something dead and disgusting, pick up pollen, fly to the next one, and move along in that way. There's some really interesting plants that have this strategy, and usually they have weird-looking flowers. Look them up. They're really interesting. Butterflies obviously pollinate Bats in many places play a key role in pollination. Again, plants providing these nectar treats to encourage movement of organisms from one to another. Birds, also, same thing. Hummingbirds are moving from one flower to another, picking out that little bit of nectar at the bottom of the flower for that sugar that they rely on, and then as they move flowers, they're moving that pollen as well, increasing the likelihood of pollinating plants from different individuals within that species to encourage diversity within these sexually reproducing populations of plants. The old standby that's really a tried and true method, though, is pollination by wind. Some plants have lost the ability to pollinate by wind and can be really, really specific in their pollinators, but many plants still pollinate by wind. Gymnosperms pollinate entirely by wind. Grasses, for the most part, also pollinate by wind. We don't usually think of grasses as being flowering plants, but they definitely are. And if you catch them at the right time, you can see the anthers, and you can give them a shake, and you can see that pollen just drifting off. Oftentimes, in the summer, if you're going through on a dry, breezy day while corn is in full pollen, you can see the pollen moving across cornfields, and it can be quite dramatic. In fact, if you've ever parked your car under a pine tree that's pollinating, it's a disgusting, sticky mess because all that pollen falls on the car. It really is a really annoying situation when pine trees sort of pollinate on a car. Water is also used to pollinate. In fact, if you're looking at the bryophytes, for example, the mosses and liverworts, they require water for fertilization of their gametes. That's a whole different group of organizations. We're talking about angiosperms now, but water is also a sort of reproductive strategy that plants still use. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about double fertilization, so making sure that we're developing an endosperm, which really becomes the food for the developing embryo of these angiosperm plants. And that really develops into the development of the seed. It goes through these different parts of the seed, the cotyledons, when we're looking at dicots and monocots, whether they have one cotyledon or two. If you think about a peanut, that's a classic sort of dicot because you can separate that peanut into those two halves. Those are the different cotyledons, which again are part of this seed development that grows into the plant. Also look at development of different fruits and different fruit types. There are many different kinds and types, so as you're going through and reading, make sure you look at these different types and understand those differences. And also fruit and seed dispersal. Much like pollination, there are many strategies that plants use to disperse those seeds. Once they've gone through the work of building and developing these seeds, they need a way to get them away from the parents to increase the sort of spread of these individuals. Some simply rely on wind, so you blow on a dandelion flower and those seeds fly away. They're just relying on simple wind to move that. Cattails as well. You see those big fluffy white clouds of cattail fluff, or for example, milkweeds, again, use wind to spread their seeds, but many different seed dispersal strategies as well. Wind, water, animal dispersal. Some seeds require an animal to eat them. Really, there's lots of different ways that seeds are spread throughout the environment. And it's all about moving plants from one place to another to increase the likelihood of high-quality new individuals being formed to spread those genes into the next generation. That's really what evolution is all about. So that sort of covers sexual reproduction, and there's also asexual reproduction. And there's lots of different ways that plants asexually reproduce through stolons and runners and things like that, rhizomes, but also humans utilize different properties of plants to reproduce plants sexually as well. So going through grafting, cutting, and layering. Also, you can do it in a lab context as well. So there's lots of different ways that plants can be reproduced asexually as well. They're a little more forgiving as far as that goes than animals, because oftentimes you can sort of stimulate root growth in artificial ways or in evolved ways to get what you want. All right, this wraps up Chapter 32 in the second part of the lecture. I will talk to you next week, and have a great weekend.